Welcome to the Creative Penn podcast. I'm Joanna Penn, thriller author and creative entrepreneur, bringing you interviews, inspiration and information on writing craft and creative business. You can find the episode show notes, your free author blueprint and lots more at thecreativepenn.com, and that's Penn with a double N. And here's the show. Hello creatives, I'm Joanna Penn, and this is episode number 776 of the podcast, and it is Tuesday, the 15th of October 2024, as I record this special in-between-isode. Now, this is a surprise show, as I checked my podcast stats this week, and the Creative Penn podcast just hit 10 million downloads, as reported by my audio host, Blueberry. The podcast is also the main content on my YouTube channel at The Creative Penn, which has had over 3.9 million views. So the total could be closer to 14 million, and I am pretty happy with that. So thank you for being a listener. So in today's show, I'll share some fun stats, and then I'll share 7 lessons learned that are also applicable for authors and other creatives on practicalities, learning as you go, building relationships, serving an audience, showing more of yourself while still having boundaries, how the business of the podcast works, and how you will only sustain what is worth it to you over the long term, whether that's writing books or podcasting or anything else. And of course, worth it is different for everyone. If you want the backlist episodes of the show and you can't find them on the feed because that only has a couple of hundred, you can always find them at thecreativepenn.com/podcast, and there's also a search bar there as well. So today's show is sponsored by my patrons who enjoyed our live office hours last week, and it was great fun. And of course, the replay is available in video and audio, and there's lots more to come in the Patreon community. So if you get value from the show and you want more, come on over and join us at patreon.com, patreon.com/thecreativepenn. Right, let's get into it. Right, we're just going to start with some quick statistics. These are fun facts. My first episode went out on the 15th of March 2009, and there are now 775 episodes of the podcast. I can hardly believe it, really. And no, I can't remember every single one, that's for sure. The show has been downloaded in 229 countries, with the top 3 being the USA at 61% of listens, the UK at 12% and Australia at 7%, and then lots of others, with the most surprising being 2 downloads from Antarctica, for which I am very happy. And on the show notes for this, there are maps and pictures from different episodes and over time and all that. The changing podcast logo, which has had multiple editions over the years. But yes, the 4 most downloaded episodes through Blueberry, so these are the most downloaded audio episodes. The number 1, writing fiction and improving your book descriptions with Michael Brent Collings at 28,264 downloads. Second, how to use mystery to hook your readers with Jonah Lehrer at 28,215. Tips for indie author success and 20 books to 50k with Craig Martell at 28,199. And number 4, author mindset, strengths for writers. Yes, the Clifton Strengths discussion with Becca Syme coming in with 27,786 downloads. So those are the top 4 listened to episodes. The 4 most watched on YouTube, although these are also listened because most of these are audio only, are completely different. Number 1, improve your dialogue with James Scott Bell, coming in with 75,200 watches, I guess, plays, I think we call it on YouTube. Second, how to sell 1 million books with CJ Lyons, coming in with 59,689. Then, how to write a novel with the Snowflake method with Randy Ingermanson, 54,209. And finally, story engineering with Larry Brooks at 52,520. So first of all, it's very interesting because those 4 are all about writing fiction. and I guess marketing fiction there with CJ Lyons, although it was a lot about craft. And they're also all older episodes, whereas the listen to ones are, older, as a couple of years, but not massively. But that one with James Scott Bell, I think, is a decade old. So why are these numbers so different? Well, an audio podcast generally gets a relatively stable number of people listening every week. So there is less variability in the numbers. So there are no episodes of the show with 200 listens. That just doesn't happen. Whereas YouTube is based on search and algorithms. So some videos get a lot of views. So of course, the 4 I mentioned get tons, but the average video on my channel may only get a couple of hundred or 1,000 views. So it is a completely different kind of audience. It's a different kind of platform. And I thought that was interesting in itself, that the content is so different. So if you do this is, of course, most of this was done on YouTube before Google Podcasts disappeared. And now they've rolled that into YouTube. So depending on when we talk next in terms of this kind of show, it may be that has changed a lot, or it might be the same, because what also tends to happen is the more popular videos get even more plays. So yeah, completely different platforms. Something to keep in mind if you are creating for different platforms. Think about who you're creating for and how it works. 7 lessons learned from over 10 million podcast episode downloads. Number 1, start where you are and improve your craft, tools and technology over time. So you don't need to know everything in advance in order to write a book or publish or start book marketing or start a podcast. Just get started and learn and adapt along the way. So I recorded my first podcast interview in March 2009. I remember I was living out in Ipswich outside Brisbane, and I had a landline and I phoned up this author, Rachel Birmingham. I put the phone on speaker, next to which I placed a handheld digital audio recorder. At least it was digital at the time. It wasn't like a tape or anything. But I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't really know how to do an interview. I did have questions, and I was super nervous. You can still listen to this episode. But despite all that, I was still able to interview a breakout self-published author in the Australian book scene, Rachel Birmingham, and it was really interesting. I didn't know what I was doing. I got started anyway. My interview skills have definitely improved since then, as well as my confidence, both as a host and a guest. And of course, everything gets better with practice, and that includes your writing as well. My tools have also changed. So, of course, I went rapidly from using the phone to Skype, which became a thing around then, to Zoom, and now Riverside FM, which has records locally on either end. I've also upgraded my microphone and pop filter several times. I actually had a tiny listen to that first episode in preparation for this. And what I noticed the most was that I clearly had nothing in front of the mic. And this is something I often tell people in the early stages of podcasting or doing any audio. You need a pop filter. It's just called a pop filter. It goes in front of the mic and it stops the plosives, the puh sounds, breathing, obviously you can hear breathing, but it stops some really difficult noises. And I can hear with my that first interview, I had absolutely nothing. I also just used to record in any room, and that room for the first interview had a wooden floor. It had barely any soft furnishings, which of course means it echoes a bit. I think my hearing I know my hearing has got a lot better since doing so much audio over the years. I now hear things that I never heard before. Over time, I did move into a padded cupboard for my audio, and now I have a home audio booth, which there's a link in the show notes. It's essentially a wooden frame with sound blankets where I record episodes like this, the weekly introduction, my audiobooks, and other things. My editing tools have also moved. I started on Audacity, I moved to Amadeus Pro on the Mac, and I now use Descript.com to edit the main audio. And Descript is amazing. You put in video or audio and then it gives you a transcript. You can edit the transcript and that edits the video or audio. It's absolutely magic. And then I master with Amadeus Pro and Auphonic to level it. I still use the same WordPress plugin, Blueberry, Blubrry, and it is one of the oldest and most reputable independent podcast hosts. And I have always paid for hosting my feed, first on AWS and then on Blueberry itself. If you are not paying for a product, so if you're using free hosting, whether that's your website, whether that's with publishing, whether that's with your podcast, then you need to question, how is the company making money? Is your content actually the product, as is the case for most social media platforms? So if you're using a free audio host, they may well be putting ads in your product. And as ever, I really love my independence. So I started as an independent podcaster. I remain an independent podcaster, and I love that. 2. Focus on value for the listeners or the readers. If you try to write a book in a market you don't read, you will likely get it wrong, and readers won't resonate with the content or buy more from you. If you start a podcast without an understanding of what the audience want, then you will fail in a similar way. But you can avoid this by being the audience you seek to connect with. When I started this podcast in 2009, I had self-published a couple of non-fiction books, and I had learned so much from those initial failures. I wanted to share what I'd learned. I was also pretty lonely as an author. I was an IT consultant at the time. We were living, as I said, near Brisbane, Australia, and I didn't have any author friends or a community. I wanted a way to virtually meet and talk to other authors so I could learn from those ahead of me on the path and maybe make some friends. Over the years since, I've continued to interview people who I want to talk to and learn from, as well as share my own lessons learned from the author journey. I never designed this podcast for a target market, but I didn't have to, because I am that market. I was the market, I remain the market. It is the same with my books. I don't write to market, I just write books about what I learn, non-fiction, and stories I want to read, fiction. And so, again, you can do this. I think, of course, customer personas and all of that is great. But if you are the market, you already know what you want. And so that's what you do. Now, the content of the podcast has obviously changed over time. And these days, I focus much more on the business of being an author as well as writing craft. But I'm still an author and I'm still a podcaster and I'm still learning. So I am still my own audience, and the downloads demonstrate the content is still clearly of value. I'm still getting downloads of the show. I'm still selling books. So I guess this was a sort of an encouragement, because for sure, people say you should design things in advance for a target market. But if you are the target market, you do stuff that pleases people like you. And that, I guess, makes it a little bit easier. And there are people like you all over the world. I think that is a good point, though. The people who are like you, who like the things you like, and we're all a bit weird in that way, right? They are unlikely to be your family. They are unlikely to be the friends you have outside of the author community. And so don't put that pressure on them. I think this is one of those things when you're a new author, you think, oh, my family are going to read my books, or my partner is, or my friends are, and they're just not your target market. Go find your weird people who are just like you out there in the world, and you will find them. 3. Everyone starts with no audience, no email list, and no clue. Back in 2009, podcasting was not popular, and it didn't really move into the mainstream until the true crime podcast Serial took off in 2014. Between 2009 and 2014, it often felt like I was howling into the wind as tumbleweed rolled past in the empty desert. Those were also the years when self-publishing was considered vanity press, and when authors who went indie were generally shunned and considered to be desperate wannabes instead of smart business people. Thankfully, that has mostly changed, and the fights about indie versus trad that we used to have back then have dissipated. to be replaced by fights about AI or whatever is the latest drama in Authorlandia. From 2014, my traffic started to take off and grew for a few years before levelling off and has remained pretty steady over the last 5 or so years. Episodes now get between 8,000 and 20,000 downloads depending on the topic. But like everyone, I started with no audience, no readers, no listeners, no books, no income from my creative work. I just worked steadily for years producing content in different ways. Slowly, people discovered the show, and maybe you can look back and think, when did you discover this show and how did you discover this show? And then people also discovered my books, mainly through word of mouth and some search engine optimization, as you could start searching for podcast episode topics. I've never advertised the podcast. Obviously, I've been on other shows and all of that kind of thing, but I've never paid to advertise the podcast. So take heart if you are just getting started, whether you're writing, podcasting, doing videos, whatever you're doing. Just create. Start by creating. Put your content out there in whatever medium you choose, and over time, you will attract an audience. 4. It's about the relationships you build along the way. The Creative Penn podcast really has changed my life in so many ways, and the relationships I've built are perhaps the most important part. It helped me find other indie authors who were doing what I wanted to do, and I was able to meet many of them online and at conferences. Some of those initial conversations on the show turned into in-real-life friendships, and others turned into business opportunities and collaborations. There's also the relationships with you, the listeners of the show, even if I don't know all of your names and everything about your lives. Audio is such a personal and intimate medium, and long-form audio even more so. You actually know a lot about me, more than some of my family sometimes. And when we meet in person or you email with your thoughts, I know there is more of a connection because you listen to the show. So thank you for making me part of your weekly listening time. As an author, you do need other writers for a sustainable long-term career. You need other people who understand the challenges of the creative life, and as I said, they are unlikely to be your family, your partner, your friends around you. You need a community, even if you're an introvert, happy working on your own most of the time, as I do. You don't need a podcast for this. Don't worry, you don't need to start a podcast. You can find people through online groups, going to conferences, social media, but you need to take it a step further. We are humans. We need to form relationships in certain ways. So if you resonate with someone, connect with them for a coffee offline or whatever your drink of choice is, or have a private Zoom call. I call this friend dating, and it's something you'll need to do multiple times over your career and your life as you change, your friends change, and of course you might change locations and life circumstances. I've moved cities and countries many times, and each time I friend date in the new location because I know I need other humans in my life. Now, obviously, this needs to be appropriate to your life, your family situation, as well as your stage on the author journey. I'm trusting that you understand what appropriate means. 5. People want to know about you. So decide on your boundaries before you're forced to. For the first few years of the podcast, I didn't do an introduction. I just jumped straight into the interview. After all, no one wanted to know about me or my life, but it turned out they did. One day, a listener emailed and suggested I do an introduction as a way for people to get to know me as well as my guests. And years later, I know many of you come for the introduction and might not stay for the interview if it's on a topic that you don't want. I've changed the introduction up over the years, adding the various different sections around news, AI updates, my personal journey, but it is a core part of the show now. And as a listener to other podcasts, I understand that listeners come back each week for the host and their take on whatever the topic is. Guests may borrow part of that attention and may get book sales or a new fan based on the episode, but listeners return again and again to the same show for the host. So this is important to remember as an author and as a podcaster, and or if you have a YouTube channel or TikTok or whatever, people come back for you. To foster this kind of connection, however you're doing this, you have to double down on being human. You have to share personal things, whether that's the inspiration for your books and stories or photos from your life, which you can put in your email newsletter or social media. And yes, you do need to do some part of this, but you also get to set your boundaries. For example, I do sometimes mention my husband Jonathan, but we don't share a last name and he has his own career. So I respect his privacy and don't share our personal photos. However, our cats, Cashew and Noisette, and photos from my research trips are all over social media. You can find them, probably my primary channel now is Instagram at JFPennAuthor. Some authors talk about their kids, but they might give them code names to protect their privacy and don't share pictures. Other authors with pseudonyms who don't want to do even that share pictures from their garden or things they like, giving an insight into them as a person without revealing identifying details. You have to decide on your boundaries, but I think you should do it early, when no one knows who you are. Because if a book takes off, or you go viral on social media, or something else happens to bring you attention, you want to have privacy in place to protect yourself. 6. Podcasting, or being an author, can be a viable business, if you design it that way. When I decided to become a full-time author, I always intended it to be a viable business. I was not going to leave my 6-figure consulting job to be a poor author in a garret. So I planned my creative business and then took action towards that goal. And there's more on this in Your Author Business Plan. And there is a picture on the show notes of my original business plan, which is a diagram. So I started writing seriously in 2006, left my job in 2011, and in 2015 I made 6 figures, and then the following year, multi-6 figures, which I have sustained ever since across multiple streams of income, which have changed over the years. I've also got my timeline at thecreativepenn.com/timeline if you want to go back and see all the steps along the way. The podcast was originally designed as part of that business plan as a marketing channel to bring people to my books and courses, which at the time were all non-fiction based. Podcasting works very well for marketing non-fiction books, and guesting on shows is a great way to reach readers, even if you don't want to start a show yourself. The early years of the Creative Penn podcast did achieve that goal of marketing. But around 2015, the hosting costs were getting expensive, and it was taking more time as I moved from ad hoc to a weekly show. Amanda Palmer's book, The Art of Asking, came out in 2014, which focused on building genuine connections with her audience and included personal stories about crowdfunding and subscriptions. It talks about embracing the discomfort of asking and highlights how openness can foster deeper relationships and support creativity. Amanda is very open, down to doing nude pictures and letting her fans write on her body, which was really not my style for sure. I'm also very British, and we are not good at the hard sell, and we never want to sound desperate. So I struggled with knowing how I could ask for money for the show after years of it being free. That year, I talked to Jim Cockrell about aspects of selling direct through our own stores as well as crowdfunding. That interview is actually just as current now as it was back then, especially as it seems indie authors are finally embracing the direct model. And this was a decade ago I talked to Jim about this. You might remember Jim as one of the original co-hosts of the Sell More Book Show. Jim, as an author, entrepreneur, I learned a lot from Jim. I read his books before I became an author. So it was always good to have Jim as a kind of a book mentor, I guess I would call him. If you do go back and listen to that, we talk about cells, which I started using back then. I moved on to PayHip, and then, of course, I moved into Shopify. There have been lots of different tools over the years, but it's the mindset stuff that he talks about that's really interesting. So I wanted to include this clip because I went back to read it and I was like, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I wanted to share. So here is a lightly edited clip from the interview with Jim, where I talk about the struggle of asking for support. And I want to share this because I know some of you might feel the same way. So here's the clip.
The whole concept of patrons goes back thousands and thousands of years, right? You know, Michelangelo had a patron, right? Patrons are a very important part of the artist storytelling community, and we've gotten away from it. We've gotten into this transaction-based hard sticker price world with e-commerce, right? I guess the whole entire concept of patronage is letting people support you. Doesn't have to be one wealthy patron who gave you a stipend to do your art for the next 30 years. You could have 1,000 people, 50 people, each giving you a little bit of money and help support you. And I believe that every artist and content creator should be trying this because it's an amazingly powerful movement. You need to use words like support. Don't ask for handouts. Say, it's my content. I'm giving it to you. If you would like to support me and the work that I do, then you can go here. It's a little psychological switch in a person's head when they hear you can support me as opposed to you can donate to me. You have so many fans who love to listen to the podcast. Would 2,000 people give you $1 every time you do the podcast?
And that's the thing, because I've now got transcripts and the time, that there is an amount I would want to make just to cover cost, let alone anything else. I have been thinking about this, but let's talk about the psychology of I'm very British. I want to talk about money. It is a very difficult thing for many people to even be thinking about these things.
This is a tough thing because we've been told and taught that it's like begging, right?
I don't want to do that. Yeah.
But you have to change your mindset, right? This is things we've been talking about, like what Amanda Palmer says in her video. I mean, you have to change your mindset.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I just wrote down, like, when I thought, why am I having the problem I have is it being independent. And that's so crazy because that's what we're talking about. I mean, I don't, like, even my mum, I would never even ask my mum for money. I had a job at 13 and the money that I needed to do for stuff. And I've always felt that way. But what you're saying actually is, to be independent, we need to develop that kind of trust. I mean, this is like an emotional risk though, isn't it? What if I put myself out there and nobody does catch me and I hit the floor?
I think it's going to depend on who your true fans are and if you've really connected with them or not. This will not work for people who create content that's not amazing. People are fans of things that really entertain them or solve their problems. So if you're not creating something amazing, this will never work for anyone, which is why it's the level playing field. Only the people who really are producing something that people want are going to be the ones who are going to be able to do this.
So I love that. And you can still listen to the whole interview with Jim on Selling Direct. If it's not on your feed, there are links in the show notes, or just go to thecreativepenn.com/podcast and search for Jim Kukral. Now, Jim is still a professional speaker and non-fiction self-help author, and you can still find him at jimkukral.com. Now, Amanda's book and the discussion with Jim helped me reframe the podcast. I decided it needed to produce income as well as be a marketing channel in order to make it worth continuing. And I'll come back to whether it's worth it later on. But at that point, I really was like, I can't do this anymore. It's costing me so much money. So in 2015, I added corporate sponsor ad reads, with the earliest being Kobo Writing Life, Drafter Digital and Pro Writing Aid, still sponsors of the show, companies I use personally and am more than happy to recommend. I expanded to add Ingram Spark, Findaway Voices, now by Spotify, and also Publisher Rocket and Written Word Media. I've been approached by quite a lot of companies who have offered me more money in terms of sponsorship, but who aren't a good fit for the show. It's important to me that I only advertise those companies I continue to use and recommend. So thank you to my corporate sponsors. You are fantastic. Also, in 2015, I started my subscription at patreon.com/thecreativepen. And originally it started as a way for listeners to support the show and get an extra solo episode a month where I answer patron questions. And yes, I've been doing the Q&A since then. The top tier of patrons also get my non-fiction ebooks as part of the subscription. And I occasionally did extra things, but the main focus was supporting the show with just a couple of dollars a month. At the end of 2023, as part of my 15-year pivot, I changed the Patreon into almost a separate community, where I now share extra weekly content, mainly on using various AI tools, as well as writing craft and author business, audio and videos. As I mentioned, I'm also doing live office hours, and I still do the monthly Q&A audio. So this has dramatically accelerated growth, and I now have over 1,200 paid patrons, some of whom have said they would stick around in the community even if I ended the podcast. But don't worry, that is not happening at the moment. So thank you, patrons. You are amazing. And I know some of you have been around since the beginning. I guess that's 9 years at the moment. That is fantastic. Come and join us if you'd like to join the community at patreon.com/thecreativepen, where you can get everything for less than a black coffee a month or a couple of coffees if you're feeling generous. And you can even download the entire backlist of those Q&As. Perhaps those older ones aren't so useful, although writing craft is pretty evergreen. Seven. You will only sustain what is worth it to you over the long term. And persistence and time in the market make a big difference. I'm not the only podcaster in the indie author community, but I'm pretty sure I'm the longest running at this point. Since I started my show in March 2009, there have been many other podcasts that have started and ended, and the same is true of the author community. There have been authors with breakout success who disappeared as fast as they arrived. Others stuck around for years but eventually faded away. There are some who are still here, many who started before me, some who came after me, who have stuck it out through the good times and the bad. And there are many good reasons people end a podcast or decide being an author is not for them. And short-term creativity is just as valid. I'm not saying you have to keep going forever. But there is only one reason to keep doing these things. It has to be worth it. Now, of course, the definition of worth it differs for everyone and it changes over time. But for me, there are a couple of reasons I continue to host the Creative Pen podcast. Patrons and listeners tell me it is still useful. And I love being useful. And even though I'm an older voice in the industry now, I still have something to contribute to the conversation, especially in the era of generative AI. And perhaps my longevity gives me some authority because I've seen so much drama rise and fall over the years, and I know this too shall pass. I'm also still learning. And my number one Clifton strengths is learner. Every conversation I have that makes me think differently or helps my craft or business is worth it. And to be able to help others by recording the conversation is an added bonus. It also makes great money. With corporate sponsors and the Patreon, in addition to affiliate links, plus, of course, marketing my books and other things over the years, the Creative Pen podcast is a significant business on its own. I love having multiple streams of income, so it's worth it financially to continue. Some people might say that loving something is enough, and that might carry you through for a while, but it's not sustainable for the long term. I loved my books and travel podcast and happily did it for a few years. The evergreen episodes are still on the feed, just search books and travel on your podcast app, and the transcripts and images are on the blog, and I did solo episodes as well as interviews. But as much as I loved those conversations and the connections, I could not figure out a decent business model for it. And I learned enough about the travel writing industry to see it was not a good fit for me. So there's nothing wrong with ending a show, and there's nothing wrong with deciding you don't want to keep pushing in an author career either. Everyone changes over time, and what is worth it for you at one book or the first 10 or 20 episodes of a podcast will be quite different by book 10 or book 20 or a podcast you were trying to do years later without enough reward. But if you do stay the course, as either an author or a podcaster, your time in the market can become an almost unstoppable force on its own. With time and persistence and continuous creation over years, you gather readers and listeners and income streams, and together they snowball into something bigger than you ever thought they might be. But of course you can't plan that at the beginning, and you don't know what will happen. I didn't know in 2009 that I would be doing a 10 million download episode so many years later. I just enjoyed the process. So I'm not promising I will be here for 20 million downloads, however long that will take. But for now, the Creative Penn podcast continues on, creatives. And I hope you will keep listening as we take another step forward on the author journey. So I hope you found this episode useful for your writing career, as the lessons are applicable for authors as well as podcasters and other creators. As ever, I love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment on the podcast show notes at thecreativepenn.com or on the YouTube channel. Message me on X at thecreativepenn or email me Joanna at thecreativepenn.com. Send me pictures of where you're listening. So back to the normal show on Monday, when I'm talking about scaling your author business with Rachel McLean. And we have a fascinating discussion about ambition, growing from being an author with one series to an imprint with multiple series and a bigger team, going wide from KU to selling direct into bookstores and more, as well as the mindset you need to take that next step, and deciding whether you want to scale or not, because it's certainly not necessary. In the meantime, happy writing, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening today. I hope you found it helpful. You can find the backlist episodes and show notes at thecreativepenn.com/podcast. And you can get your free author blueprint at thecreativepenn.com/blueprint. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on Facebook and X at The Creative Penn, or on Instagram and Facebook at JFPennAuthor. Happy writing, and I'll see you next time.